My name is Jeffrey Chavis, and I am the Vice Chair of the Baltimore chapter of ACM. And it gives me great pleasure to have the honor and opportunity to introduce our first speaker for the evening. Our first speaker for the evening is Professor Leonard Kleinrock. Professor Kleinrock is a distinguished professor of computer science at UCLA. He is considered a father of the internet, having developed the mathematical theory of data networks, the technology underpinning the internet as an MIT graduate student in 1962. His UCLA host computer became the first node on the internet in September 1969, from which he directed the transmission of the first internet message. Dr. Kleinrock is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, is an IEEE Fellow, an ACM Fellow, an Informs Fellow, a CHM Fellow, an IEC Fellow, an inaugural member of the Internet Hall of Fame, the Guggenheim Fellow, and an eminent member of Eta Kappa Nu. Among his many honors, he is the recipient of the National Medal of Science, the Erickson Prize, the NAE Draper Prize, the Marconi Prize, the Dan David Prize, and the Okawa Prize, the BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award, and the ACM SIGCOM Award, the IEEE Leonard G. Abraham Prize Paper Award, and the IEEE Harry M. Good Award, along with the IEEE Alexander Graham Bell Medal. The next voice you will hear will be of Professor Leonard Kleinrock, and let me just say that I got the opportunity to meet Len many years ago at the TTI Vanguard conference. Len is an amazing individual and is an even better storyteller, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Leonard Kleinrock.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to discuss with you, if you will, the origins of the internet. You heard some of the elements in that introduction earlier. I'm going to fill in some of the details. So 1969, going back a few years, was an incredible year. First man landed on the moon. A bunch of young people were dancing all over up in New York State. An event with probability 0 occurred. First 747 to the flight. There was a killing spree in Los Angeles. Oh, and by the way, the internet was born. And nobody noticed. Even we who were there did not notice. And so I want to talk about those early days. There was a culture that was prevalent at that time, around the time we did this early work. And we were using words like the following. Words like ethics, trust, open, free, shared. This was the early internet culture. It's the way we thought about the world. And it allowed us to have an amazing, productive era of innovation, of new development, of research and engineering. And unfortunately, it's not quite the case today. And I want to go through some of this history with you. So what makes the internet tick? Well, you all know, basically, it's the people. People who contribute their creative juices to the network, and the culture, which allows them to, in fact, do that sharing in an open, free, ethical way. And essentially, as a result of those two, we end up creating communities. That is, in some sense, the power of the internet. And of course, the future is already here. Everyone knows about the internet. My 19-year-old granddaughter knows about it. My 90-year-old mother knew about it, and they were both on the internet at the same time. It's penetrating every aspect of our lives, but it's only exited its early teenage years. During that period, it was acting like a teenager. It was mischievous, erratic, unruly, and disobedient. And we hoped that it would grow up and mature and remove this kind of behavior and become a responsible citizen. Unfortunately, we've seen it's not quite done that. So let's look at a brief history of the internet. How far back was the vision when people began to think about what we now use and think of as the internet? I'm going to quote basically a very early a phrase that was used, a prediction, and I'm going to paraphrase it. Basically, whoever this was said, it'll be possible for a businessman in New York to instantly communicate with his colleague in London or elsewhere, using a device no larger than a watch to deliver any picture, character, drawing, or print anywhere in the world. Now, if you think about what's being said here, this is a vision of what we now call the internet. It's got many of the elements: speed, instant, tiny device, simple device, send all kinds of media across, and in fact, at almost no cost. Well, the person who said this was that gentleman whom you will recognize as Nikola Tesla. And he had that vision more than 100 years ago. So the idea is the vision was there. It just had to wait for technology to catch up with the vision to be, in fact, realized and implemented. There were other early visionaries some years later. In 1938, H.G. Wells with his world brain. In 1945, Vannevar Bush with his brilliant idea of a collective memory. He called it the Memex. In 1960, Linklater articulated this thing he called the man-computer symbiosis. Put people and machines together and you get some wonderful creativity. I had a vision in 1969. And one of the things I did in that period was to show the following picture on many of my talks in the 1970s. This is a picture of somebody sitting at a terminal, gaining access to whatever's out there, which we now call the internet. There's no power cable. There's no communications cable. It's a kind of wireless, ethereal communications. So the vision was there by many people. Now, before the beginning of the internet, there were two parallel threads that were taking place, and we're going to go through both of them. The first is what I like to call the theoretical thread. It started when I entered MIT in 1957, and we'll follow that in a moment. But the second thread was the government thread, and that was all about the following. Some of you may recall that in 1957-58, there was something called the International Geophysical Year. It's that year, the scientists around the globe were measuring its properties, its oceans, its mountains, its continents, its atmosphere, its climate. And in the early part of that year, in 1957, the Russians jumped the gun and launched Sputnik. And they sent that satellite around the world, beeping the way you just heard, annoying everybody, and essentially annoying then President Eisenhower. And he realized at that point that the United States was no longer the leader in technology. And he vowed that would never happen again. So 4 months later, he created the Advanced Research Projects Agency. The function of the agency was basically to support technology, engineering, math, science, to bring up the capability of America and become number one in those fields again. But that didn't stop the Russians. Just a year and a half later, they launched a spacecraft that hit the moon. A year and a half after that, they put the first man in space. A little while later, they whacked Venus with a spacecraft. And that got President Kennedy a little upset. And he said, we're going to put a man on the moon by July of 1969. Well, sure enough, that happened. So we're going to follow that thread in a little while, but let's take the theoretical thread first. I started my PhD research, as I said, when I went to MIT, and I decided to find a problem to work on. And I wanted to do a problem that would have potential in an area nobody else was working on. And at MIT, I was surrounded by computers, and I recognized that sooner or later, they're going to have to talk to each other. And in fact, I realized there was no appropriate networking technology that would handle that. So here was a problem that was new, nobody was working on it, an important problem, one that would have impact if you could solve it. And I had an approach. Perfect, that's exactly what I was looking for. So I started to look in these areas. So to give a picture of that decade very quickly, in '59, I set out to discover the principles of data networks. I published a proposal in early '61, developed a mathematical theory of data networks, introduced the concept of packet switching and analysis. I followed dissertation at the end of 1962. They decided to make a book out of it. I immediately joined UCLA faculty, and we'll go through some of the details right now to pick up some of the technology for those ACM technology people in the audience. This is a picture of my thesis proposal. It was submitted and accepted in July of 1961. The title is interesting. It was called Information Flow in Large Communication Nets. I was heavily influenced by Claude Shannon, who saw that when you take a large number of elements and mix them, properties emerge that you wouldn't see in smaller systems. So I decided to look at large systems. And here is the opening page of my proposal, and it addressed the following. It said, look, we're going to look into large networks. It's going to consist of nodes and links that sorts, receive, transmit, sort. They enter and leave via the links. We're going to ask for the response time. What about the capacity? What's the storage capacity you need? What routing discipline should we use? Queuing discipline. When does it jam up? What's the transient behavior? And on with all of these things. And the problem that was trying to face was the following. Voice traffic is very different from data traffic. With voice traffic, you dedicate a pipe to a conversation for the entire duration of that conversation, even though occasionally we stop speaking, as I just did. We're silent roughly 1/3 of the time in a duplex channel. As it turns out, data traffic is not at all like that. It's highly bursty. It's silent most of the time. Imagine whacking a keyboard over a gigabit channel. That channel is almost always sending nothing. And since data channels are expensive, we couldn't afford to permanently assign a dedicated pipe to data. So what's the solution? Solution is the following. Dynamically share the resources. Namely, don't assign a resource, a pipe, a channel, to traffic that's not yet there. When you need it, you'll get it. When you're done, let go of it, let somebody else use it. Dynamically share the resources on a demand basis. Now, that was already being done in time-sharing systems in the late 50s and early 60s. They were sharing basically computer resources, that computing capability. Many people sharing on an as-you-needed demand basis. So I figured out, why not do the same thing with the channel capacities of communication networks? Similar picture, those red resources will only be used when there's data there to be sent. And that was the idea of using dynamic resource sharing. Basically, I set up the analytical model, used queuing theory, recognized that was the tool to be used, solve the model. Once you can solve it, you can optimize it. I optimized the capacity assignment, the topology, the routing procedures, sort and introduced dynamic adaptive routing control, looked at different queuing disciplines, among which was basically taking long messages and chopping up into fixed length segments, which we later called packets. And I talked about analyzing that. And basically then looked at the underlying principles of all of this. Even though you could solve it and optimize it, what were the principles that were being exposed that you could use in other systems? So if you look at this, an early model I put up was a picture like this, which said basically you chop something into fixed length pieces and ship them one at a time. And the analysis came up with that equation, which was an exact equation for the response time of packetized messages. And it basically showed one of the key principles of packetization, namely that long messages don't mind being bumped by very short messages, but the reverse is absolutely not true. You don't want a short message to wait a long time for a long message. So let little guys get in first. They'll filter through with a small interference of the big guys. That's one of the main advantages of packet switching. So continuing, basically we look at a more general network. You want some things out of this network. You want the response time, what we call the average network delay. You have to know the traffic on each channel. You need to know the throughput the network is trying to provide. And you need to know how long it takes to move over this little blue channel. In terms of those four numbers, you can write down the following equation, which I did. This was the key equation for network response time, the mean network response time. And the interesting thing, not only is it simple, it's exact. There are no approximations here. And so it basically opened up the ability to analyze these networks. Basically, from that, you can do some optimal network design. You can optimize the capacity, et cetera, how much capacity to put on each channel. If you have a fixed amount of capacity to share a main network, that's the answer. If you do that, you then want to assign that capacity, and you find that the optimal response time is given by this formula. So the point is the analysis was going forward. It exposed some principles. First principles I already mentioned, dynamic resource sharing. Only assign a resource to data or needs that are present. And there's many ways to do that. Message switching is one. Polling, you ask. If somebody needs it, you give it. If they don't need it, you pass them by and move on. Asynchronous time division multiplexing. And packet switching. But recognize, and it's important, packet switching is only one way to get the main principle, number one, namely the idea of dynamic resource sharing. Another thing that came out was an economy of scale. It turns out if you scale up the throughput and the capacity of a network, of any queuing system, you get much better performance. You can improve the response time. You can improve the efficiency, improve the throughput, all simultaneously. And third, the idea of adaptive dynamic routing, basically to show that it was efficient, stable, robust, and it works. And those are the kind of underlying principles that you come out when you do an analysis like this. So these threads of inquiry were emerging. This is while ARPA grew, as I say, in this period, ARPA was formed in 1958. There was this research community that I started to describe to you that was generating the underpinnings of the technology. There were three efforts. The first one I just talked about, the one that I was involved with, the MIT thread. And again, the thesis proposal in early 61, the paper on packetization in April 62, the dissertation by the end of 62. But meanwhile, there was another independent thread of research at the RAND Corporation by Paul Barron. He also was talking about and looking at packet switching and the structure of networks. And he was concerned more with the end-to-end behavior and the architecture of these networks. And he published his paper on this hot potato routing in September 62, where he did introduce the idea of using the Dijkstra algorithm for updating the routing behavior, the path lengths, and the optimal paths as you move along. And in August of 64, he published a multi-volume group on a lot of his research. So that's a second independent thread. The third thread was out of England, the National Physical Laboratory, Donald Davies. He was looking more at the engineering aspect. He started looking at this in 1966 in terms of publishing it. And in the late 60s, early 70s, he actually created the first packet switch before ARPA and the United States did, but it was only a one node network. And a one node network does not a network make. So he didn't get the funding to make a bigger network. So these are the theoretical threads, the mathematical threads, if you will. And the interesting thing is that the theory behind what the internet would, how it would perform, was worked out before it was deployed and implemented, which is not always the case. And happily, that was the case here. But nobody in the telecommunication industry cared. In the 60s, when this came out, nobody was interested. But ARPA, which now is moving along, was posed to take this work and implement it into a deployed network. So let's look at the second thread I talked about, the government thread. ARPA steps in. Licklider, who I referred to before as the man-computer symbiosis, he headed up ARPA's computer group starting up in 1962. He was succeeded 2 years later by one of my MIT classmates, Ivan Sutherland. Sutherland came to UCLA and said, look, you have a theory for making a network. You have 3 identical IBM configurations. Put them together and make a network. And the technology was clearly available and ready to go, but it never happened. And it never happened because of bureaucratic infighting. People couldn't agree to put their computers on a shared network. By 1966, Taylor succeeded to Sutherland. And by then, there were a lot of research groups around the country who were providing enormous capability at their local site. And Taylor said, look, let's network these computers together so they can share their resources. So we hired Larry Roberts, another classmate of mine, as chief scientist in 1966 to build that network. So now we had merged the theory and the government threads and ready to go. Larry himself was aware of my MIT research. He, in fact, was an office mate of mine. So we knew there was a theory And he recognized that we were able to prove that the packets wouldn't fall on the floor. And so he could spend these millions to create this network. And off we went. So the beginning. In 67, a group of ARPA researchers got together to create a spec. We wrote this spec, sent it out to industry, asked the industry to bid. By the end of 68, ARPA accepted a contract from a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Bolt, Baranek, and Newman. They won the contract. It was their job to deploy a network and send the first node out to UCLA by September of 1969. UCLA was chosen to be the first node because they had this research group going and the technology to understand the way they should perform. On July 3rd, before the network was deployed, UCLA put out a press release. There it is, came out basically in July of 1969. And at the end of it, on the second page, there's a direct quote. Was my vision at that point, is what the network would look like. It said, as of now, computer networks are still in their infancy, but as they grow up and become more sophisticated, we'll probably see the spread of computer utilities. Well, we call those things web-based IP services today, which, like present electric and telephone utilities, well, that's an always-on, invisible technology, will service individual homes and offices across the country, a ubiquitous service. So this vision was fairly prophetic, but it totally missed the idea of social networking. The fact this was not about computers talking to each other, it was about people communicating. And I didn't realize that until email came in 1972. One aspect of this vision, which is still not been realized, is this idea of invisibility, that the network should be everywhere and embedded and disappear into the infrastructure. We'll talk about that in just a moment. By 69, the first router appeared at UCLA. In October 29th, the first message was sent from UCLA to Stanford Research Institute. So what did it look like in that period? Well, before 69, UCLA had its host computer. I was running a time shared service for the computer science department. And in September 69, that first switch arrived that we now call a router, the first interface message processor. That's what it looks like. Telephone booth side device. That's IMP number 1 you're looking at. Still exists at UCLA. That's the control panel. That's what the inside looks like. It's quite beautiful, if you will. It's so ugly, it's beautiful. That was the first host and the first router, the first IMP. In October, the second router appeared up at Stanford Research Institute, 350 miles to the north. They got the second IMP, they connected their host. And that red line is the first piece of the backbone network ever deployed. It was deployed in October of 1969, and it was running the blazing speed of 50,000 bits per second. Today, that's a joke. In those days, that was glorious. It was broadband. So we decided to keep a log. So we stole one of the notebooks from the host computer at UCLA, started in October 69 to keep a log. And the most important entry in that log is this one. On October 29th, 1969, at 10:30 at night, Charlie Klein, my programmer, wrote into the log and he said, talk to SRI host to host. That is the only record of the first message ever on the internet. There was no camera, no voice recording, only an entry in a funny little logbook. And the setup was this: UCLA's host computer, our switch, the high-speed line, second switch, and SRI's host. That was the first message of the internet. But what was that first message? Was it something really good, like Samuel Morse, what hath God wrought? Or how about with Alexander Graham Bell, Watson, come here, I need you? Or Neil Armstrong, one giant leap for mankind. Those guys were smart. They understood the public relations, the press, the media. We were not at all sophisticated. All we wanted to do was log in. We didn't have a good message. And to log in, you have to type LOG, and the remote computer will know what you're doing. It'll type the IN for you. So here we go, ready to do our dumb little message. But the idea is to log in remotely to prove the way this network should perform, which means you sit at one machine, you use the network to log into a remote machine and use its services remotely. So to log in, you get that capability. So here we go. That's the setup. And Charlie is down here at UCLA, Bill Duval up here at SRI, and we put a telephone connection between the two just to make sure we knew what was going on. And the irony here is that we're using the telephone network to deploy a new networking technology, which will destroy the telephone network. But there we were. So we sent the L, and Charlie said, "You get the L?" And Bill said, "Yep, got the L." And an L printed on Charlie's terminal. We sent an O. He said, "You get the O?" "Yep, got the O." The O printed. Sent the G. "You get the G?" Crash. So the first message ever on the internet was low. Very simple, profound, prophetic message. I expanded a little bit later on and said that's lo and behold, a more prophetic, more profound, more succinct message we could not have asked for, and it was by accident. But now you know, first message was low, October 29th, 1969, 10:30 at night at UCLA, from UCLA up to SRI. So that's now a documentary movie by Werner Herzog. It's available on Netflix. You can find it there. And I'm going to show you the opening scene from that network, from that movie. And here it is.
Let's enter this very special place. That machine over there is the first piece of internet equipment. This is a military hardened machine. It has a unique odor, and it was from here that the first message was sent. A revolution began.
So that's the way it began. And so what happened after that? Well, we were young engineers working at the time. We didn't know any better. So we launched enough to do what hadn't been done before, to create this new technology, to create a research network and do the engineering for it. We had a model, we had analyzed it, we knew how it should behave, but we were engineers. And we also know what we didn't know. We knew that we had to experiment with this thing to see how it really worked and define things we hadn't anticipated. So that's a very important message for the entire audience here, all of you ACM members. So let's watch the growth of the internet. From 1969, from when it began, when it looked like that, it was originally 2, 3, 4 node network, until 1988, when it grew across the country early on, a rather large network. It basically grew very fast, in a very friendly way, very ethical way, broadly, until 1988. A graduate student unleashed the first internet worm, a virus, and it hit about 10% of the computers on the network. And we said, ouch. We said, uh-oh, what's going on here? But then we thought about it and we say, it's an aberration. Don't worry about it. Big mistake. We should have been much more aware of this problem. So from 88, it continued to grow. Dot-coms came online. The backbone went to gigabit speeds, thanks to Al Gore, the information superhighway. The web began to roll out until 1994. 2 attorneys introduced broad-based spam on our message, on our network. And we said, uh-oh, and this time we said, ouch. We complained to these guys. We sent email back to them and said, you can't do this. What is it they did? Well, if you haven't seen the first spam message, here it is. Sent out on April 12th, 1994. It said, there's a green card lottery, and if you come to us and pay us, we'll help you get in that lottery. They were advertising on our research network. How dare they? As I say, we complained. We sent email back to them. We said, stop, cease and desist, shame on you. Don't do this. We sent so much email back to them, we took down their server. So as an unintended consequence of the first spam message, we created first denial service attack. Unintended, but there we are. Well, this basically ushered in the dark side. Basically, the dark side developed. It includes all the things you know about, all the bad stuff you are subject to now. And the enablers for the internet, not only the dark side, but for the internet, what enables the internet so powerfully? Allows anybody in a basement with a computer and internet access to reach hundreds of millions of users easily, instantly, at no cost in money or effort, anonymously. That in some sense is the power of the network, and it's also a perfect formula for the dark side. Well, a tipping point occurred. In those early days, we had no interest in patenting or IP, intellectual property, or private ownership. We were just doing this thing for the challenge. We were a bunch of nerds doing this. We're creating new technology, a new world. But in 1994, when that first spam message appeared, it changed quickly. The World Wide Web became a household presence. Some major sites appeared. What happened to the early internet that I knew? Well, our wonderful creation that could do this magnificent services suddenly ended up being used to sell detergent. 50 million users worldwide at that time. And the commercial world recognized immediately, wow, this is a powerful shopping machine. It's not a research engine. It's a gossip chamber. It's an entertainment channel. It's a social club. And so it became a money-making machine and took a serious left turn. It went not only from being a nuisance of hackers that I mentioned before, like a teenager, but now we have serious and dangerous players, nation states. Look what's happening in the world today, organized crime. So if you look at the people who brought all this to us, let's go over that. They were the early pioneers. I've mentioned all their names already. They were the implementers who deployed some of the early technology, the people who added services, the launches of the big apps, and finally the billionaires. Time is going down the page. It took over 20 years for those billionaires to appear, but they did. But the question is, were these people necessary? Question is, the answer is the internet would have emerged if none of those people were born. We were lucky. We were there at the right time. This was in the air. Tesla already told us about it, and so did many other visionaries. As I said, it was waiting for technology to catch up with the vision. So the next phases of the internet infrastructure will be, of course, nomadic computing, ubiquity, mobility, blockchain, distributed ledgers, IoT, software agents, invisibility. And in fact, invisibility is an important thing, as I mentioned before. The internet should be as simple and convenient to use as is electricity. Electricity is a couple of holes in the wall. You plug in, you get electricity. There's no complicated interface. There's no login. There's no nothing. Just get it. It's not the case today. It's not as simple as that. When I walk into a room, the room should know I'm there. It should provide to me all my services that I want. And it should be able to interact with the systems using human communication, speech, gestures, haptics, even a brain-computer interface, perhaps. The invisibility is not yet there. But if you want to ask what's going to happen, the infrastructure is easy to predict. Nomadic computing is coming. It's come. Ubiquitous computing, intelligent software agents, embedded technology, intelligent devices, smart spaces, Internet of Things, virtual augmented reality. All of that's been happening. The internet, in fact, will be a pervasive global nervous system. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the infrastructure. If you ask about the applications and services, sorry, not easy to predict, very difficult to predict. We have failed at every fork in the road where these things have appeared. Let me show you some of them that we didn't anticipate. And they constantly surprise us. We didn't anticipate email, the web, peer-to-peer file sharing, blogs, user-generated content, search engine dominance, shopping engines, social networking, distributed ledgers, blockchains, cryptocurrency, reputation systems, circles of trust, expert curation. All these things came out of the blue, suddenly, unanticipated, explosive. So what have we done? We have created a global system for constantly shocking us with surprises, and that's a good thing. That means there's opportunity there for new apps and services and technology to be deployed and contribute. So basically, right now, we've created a new laboratory at UCLA called the UCLA Connection Lab to shape the future and basically bring about that same kind of world we wanted before, but replicate the environment that led to the internet. So we've come a long way. Or have we? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kleinrock, for that informative and interesting talk. Like I said, he's a great storyteller, and I love when he tells that story about first message on the internet. We have some time to take some questions, and so if there's questions in the room, we'll take them. Also, there's some questions on chat. So I'll start with a question from chat, and I'll kind of work backwards through here. So the first question was about the internet worm that was that you talked about, and the question was that unleashed intentionally or unintentionally?
That's a good question, and it's a controversy. Robert Morris claims he didn't mean to release it. He says basically his roommate did. It's not clear. But what's interesting is his father worked for the NSA at the time, and his father said it's a good thing. And at the time when we heard the father saying that, we said, what are you talking about? That's not a good thing. You've annoyed the internet. The fact is he was basically, perhaps unwittingly, warning us about the future to come and the bad side of this network. So the answer is, the claim is it wasn't released intentionally. Was it? Ask Robert Morris.
Got it. Thank you. We've got another question here on the chat log, and the question is, what was used to carry the data signal from UCLA to SRI? Good
question. We took AT&T long lines. There was a digital network at the time, was sending data, and we removed their circuit switches and we put in our packet switches, those IMPs. And so we're using AT&T infrastructure, but our switches to send the message. It was basically using a new tariff called the Telpac tariff. And we were ganging together a bunch of 4.8 kilobit per second lines to get the 50 kilobit per second line. And it was 50 kilobits per second, not 56, which was the standard a little bit later.
Thank you. I see two other questions here on the chat, and let me know when we, right. Okay. There's a question about, I guess you talked about there were a number of other organizations, collaborators, and organizations and people involved with the rollout of the internet. So the question is, what was the role and contribution of the University of Illinois?
So University of Illinois was one of the early sites that ARPA began to fund when it first got formed. They had high performance computing capability, and their supercomputers were of interest to the rest of us. So they made their services available as a service, but not particularly on the underlying network infrastructure. They were one of the early sites to come on. And that was one of the reasons that Bob Taylor recognized he wanted to put computers on the network. University of Utah had excellent graphics. SRI had great database. UCLA had simulation. Illinois had high performance computing. And so those are the kinds of things that basically convinced Bob Taylor, let's create this network.
Awesome. All right. And I have a
question here.
Oh, we have a question from the room. All right. Question from the room.
Yeah, this is Wale Akimpelu. I want to follow up on the link between SRI and UCLA. Did you have a modem in front of your terminals? And did you design the modems, or was that designed by the carrier?
Okay. The setup was our programmer sat at a terminal connected to our time-shared computer, just like a regular terminal. That host computer was connected to the IMP with a cable, and the IMP itself had modems designed to talk to those high-speed lines. The IMP itself was the packet switch, and it had to design its own modems, its own protocols, its own software. So we weren't using AT&T modems, we were using our own modems to interface with the line interfaces that AT&T provided.
I have a question this is from the chat. The question is, how do you feel IPv6 reflects the original spirit of the internet?
Well, you could say the same thing about IPv4 or IP in general. The spirit of the internet was, I said, open, shared, flexible, free, etc. The IP world, the internet, TCP and IP, allowed multiple networks to interact. And that was the contribution of that particular protocol pair. IP was the underlying hop by hop transmission within a network. TCP was end to end across gateways that allowed different networks to connect to. You can't argue that the TCP IP or even the early network control protocol was instantiating the vision. The vision was to allow people to talk to computers and computers to talk to computers. The network allowed that. The protocols enabled it. But the idea of introducing layered protocols on top of the infrastructure was very important. And in that sense, TCP and IPv4 and 6. But IPv6 introduced some more security. It introduced a larger namespace. It introduced other functionality. But I wouldn't single out IPv6 as a critical step. And in fact, it's not been all that well deployed at this point as well. TCP IP was a very significant contribution to allow internetworking taking place.
Hey, we've got a question from the room.
Yeah, Professor Kleinrock, interesting talk to see the history of internet. This is Ashutosh Datta from Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. So the question here is 50 years back or more than 50 years back when internet was born, did you anticipate how it's going to look like 50 years from then? And has it met your expectation, the evolution of internet, what has happened as of today?
Great question. I covered some of that. I did have a vision where I talked about the ubiquity, the IP services, and I talked about the invisibility. It has not yet achieved the invisibility, as I said toward the end of my talk, but I totally missed, as I said, the social networking side. It caught up to that very quickly with the introduction of email. But there was a vision, and much of it has been appreciated. But now with IoT and intelligent software agents, we're beginning to see basically the capability disappear into the infrastructure, into the embedded technology in our walls, our fingers, our cars, our homes, etc. So I had the vision, so did others. As I say, Tesla had this magnificent vision. He had most of it in mind. He didn't mention video because there was no video at the time. So the answer is yes, I had a vision. A lot of it's been implemented. Some I missed and some has not yet occurred.
Okay, we've got two more questions here I think we can get to. We have a question. Do you see the internet to continue to be a best effort internet for all services and thus compromising QoS? Or do you see the internet going to logical internets through slicing to support multiple quality of service for a variety of applications and data types? So
I see a mix.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I see a mix. Clearly, there's a need for both of those. We're really addressing some of the issues of the open internet, if you will, net equity, if you will. The ability to differentiate service on a cost basis is interesting, but it does interfere with young startups getting started and being disadvantaged at the pricing level and the access level. So I believe there's a need for both. Net neutrality, I see there's a chat question coming up on that right now. I believe in net neutrality. I believe it's important. I don't want to see the bigger organizations squash the small ones. And we're seeing a real problem today in the giants taking over and not making it possible for the new startups to get in. And it's done by pricing. It's done by selection, by favoritism. It's done by what's presented to the user. It's done by pricing. And it's done by the way in which they deal with your privacy issues. So I am a strong supporter of net neutrality. And yet I can see that if there's an organization that wants a private network to support a particular application, they will do that whether or not we allow it. They can make that happen. But what I don't want to see happen is the move that's occurring, not so much from a financial point of view, but from a political point of view, and that is the balkanization of the network, the splintering of the network, where for privacy reasons and governmental jealousy reasons, governments are putting walls around their country's networks. They can turn them on and off. They can decide what comes in and goes out. And once you do that and you get a balkanized network, you've lost the magnificence of the internet, which is a worldwide network. If you fractionate it, you don't get the full access. You've lost a lot of the capability and, if you will, the dream and the goal of the original internet.
Thank you. And you know, we have one last question, which I think is a great follow-up to that. And so the question is, what is the next significant internet-related technology development that you are most interested in?
Well, I'm following a few. Clearly, quantum computing is a fascinating area which comes and goes, is elusive and not, but it certainly offers some intriguing capabilities. The whole metaverse is another world we're looking at, which brings up the issue of blockchain, which is a kind of virtual world in which a lot of this takes place. I believe blockchain and the whole distributed ledger world is a significant development. I know there's a lot of controversy over if it's a flash in the pan, whether it's corrupt or whether it's going to stick. The trouble with blockchain is the following. People like to compare it to the importance of the internet. The internet, as I pointed out, had 20 years, 25 years to be curated by engineers, by applications, before the money question came in, before the profit motive came in. And so it could protect itself against some of the abuses we're seeing today. Blockchain came out of the gates with a $sign in its mouth. And it very quickly went into the world of finance and corruption and fraud and all the rest. Notwithstanding the fact that it's a fantastic technology with enormous promise yet to be realized. So in answer to the question, I see blockchain as one of the really important developments of the future.
Awesome.
And a distributed ledger in particular.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Professor Kleinrock. We had a few other questions, but we're running short on time. And so there are a few questions in the chat. Professor Kleinrock, if you wanted to respond to those questions, you can. If not, we understand. But we have these questions, and sorry, we ran out of time. In recognition of you giving this talk today, we want to show our appreciation to you and our thanks. And we're going to do that through this plaque that we're going to be virtually presenting today, but sending out a physical plaque to you. And it reads, the ACM Baltimore chapter extends its appreciation to Professor Leonard Kleinrock for delivering the inaugural invited talk for the ACM Baltimore chapter seminar for 2022, Laurel, Maryland, February 24th, 2022. And again, thank you, Professor Kleinrock, for that interesting and invigorating and insightful talk. I know I learned a lot, and I would imagine a lot of people learned a lot about how the internet actually developed. And lo and behold, now we have this great thing. So thank you. Let's
my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.